Welcome to Novelist Spotlight, the podcast where published fiction writers are interviewed to gather their insights and writing lessons so we can use them to make ourselves better and more effective writers. Now, on with our program. Thank you for joining us. In the spotlight is Russell James. He was raised on Long Island, New York, that is. He spent too much time watching programs such as Chiller and The Night Stalker and Dark Shadows, despite his parents' warnings not to do so. Bookshelves were filled with Stephen King and Edgar Allan Poe books. By and by, moved on to Cornell University, where he graduated, then on to the University of Central Florida. Did a tour flying helicopters in the U.S. Army. Now he spins twisted tales, best read during the daylight hours. Russell James is a horror writer, if you're not getting the picture already. And he's penned more than 20 horror thrillers, including Dark Inspiration, Q Island, and The Playing Card Killer. He's authored the Grant Coleman Adventures series, starting with Cavern of the Damned, and the Ranger Kathy West series as well, starting with the novel titled Claws, as in claws, like cat claws, bear claws, and so on. He now lives in sunny Florida. Russell James, welcome to the program.
Hi, Mike. It's great to talk to you in this spooky Halloween season that we're in.
Yeah, this is well timed. Yeah, with Halloween coming up and starting to get colder, shorter days, more dark hours. When you were flying helicopters in the Army, I'm curious, were you flying transport helicopters or attack helicopters?
I was flying UH-60 Black Hawk medium lift helicopters.
So those Black Hawks are attack helicopters, correct?
No, these are troop transports and light lift or medium lift capability, sling loading vehicles and taking supplies place to place.
How many years in the Army were you?
5 years.
5 years in the Army.
Yep.
And did you have any experiences in the Army that ended up becoming something that was part of your writing?
One of my novels, Dark Vengeance, has a helicopter pilot in it, and there is a helicopter attached to the town for this big fair that they have going on, and that becomes a big deal in the last half of the novel. So I got to apply some helicopter knowledge to that. It's as a helicopter pilot, it's really frustrating when you see really dumb things happen in movies, where helicopters, the pilots are doing things that don't work in real life and no one would ever even try. So I wanted to make it as realistic as possible in that book. Yeah,
I get it. So your parents had warned you not to watch those programs. What was the warning about? Was it just get to bed, it's too late to be up? Or was it, did they tell you that something might go wrong in your life if you were paying too much attention to the horrors of these imaginative shows?
Actually, I think my parents just weren't real horror fans, although when Stephen King started to get big, we ended up with a lot of Stephen King books on the shelf. So I think that was part of their conversion. But I was actually very lucky that my parents encouraged reading at a very early age. Before even kindergarten, I had asked my parents if they would teach me to read because it seemed interesting because they were doing it, and they did. And they've been great at encouraging that and encouraging, creativity all through the time I was growing up. So I really am thankful for that.
One of the shows I didn't see on the list was, not that your bio has a comprehensive list, but The Twilight Zone, written by the great Rod Serling, is not on that list. Was that part of your viewing as well?
Oh, absolutely. The Twilight Zone is a heavy influence. And that one definitely got the blessing of my parents to watch The Twilight Zone. And
sophisticated horror, don't you think? I mean, he did things that were rather than monsters or ghosts and goblins. His stuff was I thought, more sophisticated and kind of made you afraid of your own mind or your fellow man.
Definitely. He was very good at touching on current phobias or issues that were in society and then turning them around into a story that you could watch. And Serling was a master of the twist ending. And most of the short stories that I write, I like to have that kind of ending in it, because you have such a compact writing space that you're working in that you can pull that off and have it be something that has some impact. So yeah, Twilight Zone is amazing.
Yeah, it's kind of set the standard. Now, another one that I used to watch growing up that was very popular was Tales from the Crypt.
Oh yeah, yep. Tales from the Crypt is a little. I was already an adult when Tales from the Crypt came out, so I didn't get any censorship watching that one. It's really interesting that the Tales from the Crypt and Twilight Zone are so successful and have a big following, and they're anthology series, and that is a very difficult medium to be successful with a broad audience. Even though those ones were tremendously successful.
There was also a program, I don't know that, well, I guess it would qualify as a horror program, but it was called The Hitchhiker. And they show the guy with the backpack in the beginning. He'd be walking down the side of a highway, backpack slung over the shoulder. And they tried to do the Twilight Zone sort of intro where he would say, just as Rod Serling would say something in the beginning and then at the end, kind of a setup and then a conclusion. They had this young guy do that. And do you remember that one?
No, I'm not familiar with that one. So he would go to different places and it would be a different story with different characters each time?
Well, it was definitely yes, it was different characters each time. He was never actually in the program. And just like Rod Serling wasn't in his own program. Okay. So he would be walking down, they have kind of this ethereal, spooky music while he's walking in slow motion with his backpack down the side of the highway, I believe it was. And he would, like Rod Serling, after they showed an opening segment, he would make some kind of arcane commentary about it. And then he'd come back at the end with kind of that finishing statement. So it was definitely formatted after the Twilight Zone style. Not of that caliber, but it was much more updated than the Twilight Zone. It was much more updated. You might look that one up on YouTube because I think you'd enjoy it if they have.
Yeah, I'll check that out.
Issues on it. They had some really good shows, and because it was updated, the production values were better than a lot of others. Although I have to say, Twilight Zone, I thought, even though it didn't have modern production values, they understood how to really make it work, and they understood what the limitations were. I thought it was always well done.
Yeah, I think they wrote for the budget, and so you'll think how hard that is when you're going to write. Several of those took place on one set, and you're going to confine your story with all the development and all the action and all the execution in this man's apartment or something like that.
Exactly.
And wow, talk about having to really work at it. That's a tough story to write.
Well, and by isolate, I mean, they created a sense of isolation oftentimes because the whole thing would take place maybe in an apartment or in a house, or in the settings were very few, almost like a Woody Allen movie these days or some of his traditional ones where the movie, I forget if it's called September or October, but it's a really dreary movie, but it's a house full of people. The whole thing takes place in a house, or Hannah and her sisters. Very, very low budget, but it's all about the interactions. It's all about, and in the case of the Twilight Zone, I think it created that sense of isolation and terror in that way. The Hitchhiker was much more, that had varied locales. Not a lot of them, but it would move around a little bit more. Oftentimes it would be people traveling. And I think that was kind of the concept, is the Hitchhiker, it's people on the move. And then strange things happen to people who are on the move when you least expect it, sort of thing. So what did you study at Cornell in beautiful Ithaca, New York?
I studied business management at Cornell.
Business management. Okay. And then you then went on to University of Central Florida after that?
No, then I went into the military, and I got out of the military after 5 years, got a job with Frito-Lay as a in food manufacturing. And while I was doing that for the next 30 years, during that time, I got my MBA on a grueling every other weekend, Saturday, Sunday plan. So
at University of Central Florida?
Correct.
Gotcha.
Which just goes to show you don't know how much free time you have until you get a full-time job and an MBA at the same time. But
there you go.
One of the positives coming out of that was seeing all of that time and saying, that was when, right after that was when I got talked into trying to write professionally as in fiction. My job at Frito-Lay was writing, training, and doing that for manufacturing. So I was doing technical writing and seeing that I could make time to do fiction writing, I went and started to give it a shot.
So you were at what stage of life at that time? Were you in your 20s or early 30s?
I was way late to the party on this. I started writing 2000. My first novel got published in 2011. So that was
well down the line.
Late 40s. Yeah.
Late 40s.
Somewhere in that range.
And yet since then you've published about 20. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
So you're obviously quite productive at what you're doing. How did you, so somebody encourages you to write, but you decided to write horror novels. So you obviously were attracted to that stuff growing up. An awful lot of us are. I mean, I think most of us grow up watching some of the programs that we've been talking about, but we don't necessarily carry on with that. You decided horror was the genre for you. Talk about that a little bit. How did you decide on that? Have you just always had, obviously from an early age you had it, but it has stuck with you?
Yeah, the first book that I read that wasn't assigned, for school, that really captivated me, where I was reading it and then suddenly looked up and realized 4 hours had passed, was Stephen King's The Stand. And after reading that, I start digging through all the Stephen King books on my parents' shelves after that. But I think that the fact that that was the first fiction that really sucked me in, it meant that was probably the kind of thing that I wanted to write. I think that really influenced me, as opposed to other things that I'd read, which I enjoyed, but they didn't really captivate me.
So how do you get your books written? What is the day-to-day game plan that you observe that allows you to crank them out?
I usually spend about half of each day writing, whether it's the morning or the afternoon, one or the other. After 4 hours, everything I'm writing seems really good. So that means that it's not. So you have to stop. So once you think, oh, that's a breeze, then you go back the next day and it's like, who the hell wrote this? So I try to do that. The story inspirations come from something that I've read or something that I've seen on television, or sometimes something I experience in life that just throws a switch and says, ooh, that would be interesting to build off that. And then the process is seat of the pants writing. I'm not the kind of person who can plot everything out, and which is odd because I'm generally a planner about doing everything. But writing, I can't do that. I've got to get in and start writing some dialogue and getting the characters doing things, and then each scene spawns an idea for a next scene, and the story will progress that way, usually from the beginning all the way through to the end. And I'll sometimes have a good idea about what kind of ending I'm looking for. So I have an idea about where I'm going to. That will change. The last book I wrote, Demon Dagger, is the only one that started in the middle. The inspiration was in the center. because I live in Central Florida, so I go to all the theme parks here. And it's fun, and I love going to them. The costumed characters are interesting. The myth is that the Mickey Mouse character always has a female inside because it's a short character and it's easier to match that height by having someone who's female. Not sure whether that's true or not. But I started thinking about that, thinking, gee, you don't know who's in there. You don't know if it's a guy. You don't know if it's a girl. You don't know what they look like. You don't know who they are. And you're trusting that, they're all vetted and they're decent people in there and they're all having a good time. And of course, being a horror writer, that now leads to, well, what if it wasn't? And this would be the perfect place to prey on people because they all have their guards down and everyone's in what they think is a safe environment and everybody's just there to enjoy themselves. So what could be done with that? How would you want to? And then that started to grow into, well, why would you need that and who would do it? And I ended up with the idea of a demon taking that position inside that character and being there to get close to an individual who would normally have their guard up. And of course, who would that be? Well, that leads to that being a demon hunter. And if we're at a theme park, the person in jeopardy is going to be that person's son. And that whole scene of walking into that ambush, first I wrote as a short story with the twist ending is there's a demon inside. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, wow, there's a lot more to this because there's a whole story of how everybody gets here. And then there's a whole story about what happens afterwards. So this was the first story where I knew the middle, and then I had to work out to both ends from there, which was very different.
You started writing. You just went through the process of starting to write, and
Yes.
without a plan, without a blueprint.
No plan.
And as you begin to develop copy and get some traction, do you then build a plan out? Do you then kind of discover where this is going to end or what you're going to do in terms of a beginning?
Yes. That I'll start the story, and as it's going, ideas will come to me about what's going to happen in the future. For example, I'm just finished, in Quest for the Queen's Temple is an adventure story about these antique dealers who go use an old journal and go in search of the lost temple of the Queen of Sheba to find her treasure. So as I'm writing that, then ideas would come up that says, okay, wow, there's going to be a sandstorm on the way there. And so I'll make a note as I'm going along and just say chapter XX, I don't know what chapter it is, sandstorm buries the caravan. And then I'll put that ahead. And then another one might be that they're going to find giant bats in the temple. So I'll put that in. So I've got some ideas and I try to keep track of them as I go. And sometimes I get to them and sometimes the story goes someplace else, but that's as close to an outline as I'll get.
What really scares people these days, do you think?
I think that when you look at society in general and what kind of stories would generally be successful across a broader group, you have to look at within the culture, what are the changes that are happening that are making people very uncomfortable, that could spin out of control. Obviously, pandemic viral issues have been in the headlines, and that's something that people are still very afraid of. I think that a very big one is the fear of technology, that where is this going? Because it seems to be accelerating faster than we have control over it. And it seems that each month there's some new amazing thing, or there's some new feature on your phone, or there's some new computer or something comes out, or there's some breakthrough about AI or transhumanism. And I think there's a big fear, probably quite justified, that one of these things is going to get just a bit out of control, and we're going to hope that we can still reel it in.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Good point. Good point. So, and you hear people warning about, even technologists warn about that. Some of the biggest technologists in the country warn that AI could become something that kind of takes on a life of its own and threatens human beings. Now, I mentioned that your bio didn't include the Twilight Zone, but you're obviously a big fan of that. The other person noticeably missing in terms of the writing list there, Edgar Allan Poe, you have Stephen King. What about Clive Barker? Have you read Clive Barker?
I've read a couple of things by Clive Barker, not because I don't like them. It was just, I'm not sure if it was just a question of availability or what, but I certainly liked his stuff. I can't remember what I've read off the top of my head, but.
Yeah, the first one I had ever read from him was called The Damnation Game, which was good. But he also has these collections of short stories called, oh God, it escapes me now. But anyway, Clive Barker, I found him to be, just the quality of his writing is quite outstanding. So, you've moved from upstate, or rather Long Island, where you've got the cold winters, dark and cold winters, which that whole milieu is great for horror in a lot of ways. Florida is sunny and bright, and what's to be afraid of when you're in the light. Do you feel that having a certain setting that you live in, that environment that you live in, has affected at all the choices that you make in terms of a storyline or what you're writing?
Oh, absolutely. I've got several stories that have Florida settings. Black Magic is set in a dying sugar town in South Florida in the Everglades, and the magic that these kids conjure up, it takes the creatures in the area, like alligators and snakes and a lot of other fun things we have slithering around down there, are a big part of that, as well as a hurricane, are part of the horror elements in that one. The story you mentioned, Ranger Kathy West, the Claws story, is set at Fort Jefferson, which is a real life national park off Key West. And that is a giant monster B-movie adventure Saturday matinee story about giant crabs attacking that fort and the folks within it. And The Playing Card Killer is a psychological horror serial killer thriller story, and that is set in the Tampa Bay area. So I get a lot of Florida works its way in.
So what should a person expect when reading a Russell James book?
Well, I hope you're drawn into it and don't want to stop reading no matter how late it is. That's my hope. Each of the books are the two series that I have, three series that I have out through Severed Press. Those are all adventure, Saturday matinee, giant monster genre kind of books. So if you're reading any of those, you're going to expect a story like that. You're going to expect Indiana Jones meets Jurassic Park kind of thing going on there. The other mainstream horror books are all very different parts of the horror they're different subgenres. So like I said, The Playing Card Killer is a psychological thriller. The Dreamwalker is almost a dark fantasy kind of story in that one. Dark Inspiration is a ghost story. Demon Dagger is like the supernatural TV show, very serious horror going on in that one. So as people come up, and for example, I'm at a convention and I've got a table full of books, and I try to find out what types of the subgenres they like, so I can direct them to one of the ones that they're going to enjoy the most.
Let's talk about those conventions. I noticed on your website, whose URL for our listeners, the URL to Russell's website is in the episode notes. You've got one called Spooky Empire in Orlando, Florida. There's one called Spookala Pop-Up Con, again in Orlando being such a big convention town. Mad Monster Party in Charlotte, North Carolina, and then MegaCon, again in Orlando. And one other is Southeast Hollows Haunt Convention. What happens? What kind of audience do you get at these conventions, and what do you I know that you have a table there, you've got your books there, you've got a setup there. What tell us a little bit about these conventions and what kind of people attend and what you get accomplished there.
Horror conventions are probably the most misunderstood gathering by the people who don't go. When you go, this is the nicest group of people that you can be with. Everyone is having fun. Some people are dressed up in costumes. Some people aren't. The people that set up there, some of them are authors like myself. A lot of them are artists selling art or something that they've created that has a horror element to it. So there's paintings and there's sculptures, and it's amazing. And the crowd is fantastic. And why I really like going to these cons, it helps because the writing process is a very isolating individual thing. You will sit and you can have no human contact with people all day while you write. You can have no human contact with your editor or your publisher or anybody or the publicist, anybody. It's all by email. So really, the great thing about the con is that finally you're meeting the people who are reading your book or someone else's horror book. And you get to talk about horror, you get to talk about writing. And when some of those folks have already read what I've written and they don't ask for a refund, then that's a real treat. And you get to get some feedback from somebody live who remembers your book and they enjoyed it. And I get home from conventions and I'm very tired, but I'm also psychologically energized and very excited, thinking, I can't wait to get back to that next book because I really enjoyed meeting the audience.
Sure, tired and inspired
at
the same time. What's the greatest horror movie of all time, do you think?
Ooh.
Or if not, if there's not a single one, name maybe two or three that you think are really standouts.
Alien
yeah.
is definitely a very suspenseful horror movie. And it's got some nice gross out scenes in it too, on top of that. Alien is definitely well done. The Exorcist, for its time, was a very well done horror movie. It's been surpassed by other films since then, but it was groundbreaking in the material that it did and the way that it delivered it. So that and the impact it's had over generations afterwards, where so many people in the film industry point back to that and say, yeah, that was a seminal moment. That was also the first major horror film that made a ton of money, that, invented the idea of the blockbuster. That was one of those early films that did that.
Yeah, I remember it was huge when it came out. It was big. Everybody was talking about it. Yep. And of course, it was the book that went with it that a lot people would go to the movie, they'd read the book, or vice versa. So every writer has a voice. How would you describe your voice, your authorial voice?
Yeah. According to my wife, I sound like me. So that it's just how it comes out. She'll frequently point to a character and say, "Oh, you would totally say this thing that person just said." It's so.
I always find that if you're writing, if you let somebody who already knows you read your copy, I don't like doing that because I feel like they know who I am. and it's kind of a unfair disadvantage the writer has when it's kind of like, well, that doesn't sound like you, or it does sound like you. I think it's a little bit of a disadvantage.
And it's worse as a horror writer, because I don't want anybody I know reading what I've written, because some of it's pretty twisted and scary in that. And then, the next time you meet them for dinner, they're trying to sit at the far end of the table from you because they're remembering
going to start to worry about
where somebody got knifed to death. Yeah. So yeah, that's definitely true.
What are you working on now? Do you have one in the works?
Right now, I'm writing the second in the Rick and Rose Sinclair series, where those antique dealers are they found a map that it may show the location of an island where Blackbeard buried his treasure before he was killed. And so that's another adventure book that's coming out. And in conjunction with that, as I wrote that story, the backstory of how Blackbeard got his treasure to this island, I had to create, so that made sense as they went to this island and found it. And I couldn't put it all in the story because it didn't progress the plot. Plus, there are a lot of things that would have happened in 1718 that no one's going to know in 1938. So having finished that, then I started a straight horror novel called Under the Skeleton Flag, with Blackbeard and a witch aboard the ship, and the witchcraft that Blackbeard employs in order to be successful, and a doctor who gets kidnapped by Blackbeard because he needs a doctor on board, and ends up being the person. You see all this through their eyes, and you watch all this, and you find out exactly how all that stuff got to the island and why. So I've been up to my neck in pirates for like 6 months.
So I assume the most influential book you've read is The Stand. You were talking about that earlier, and when you read that, you were engrossed in it.
Yes.
It kind of set you off on this genre.
Yep.
What is the biggest writing lesson you've learned? You've been writing for years now, so along the way, you must have picked up some tricks, or you were given some information by somebody that you were able to apply to great effect. What would you say is the biggest lesson learned?
That it's not a completely inspirational process, which some people think of it that way, or they think of it that way, like someone's painting and that they get inspired to do a painting. There is a part that's inspiration on it, but there is a lot of it that's perspiration. And you have got to, if you want to be serious about it, you have to treat it seriously, and you have to make time for it. You have to prioritize it, and you have to do it frequently, because it's a muscle. It's a mental muscle. But the more you do it, the better you can get at it, and the faster you can get at it. So having that discipline to treat it like a job is critical if you're going to make a go of it. If you just have one story and that's the thing you always want to put out, and that's great. You can go and you can do that. But if you want to keep doing it, you really need to work at it.
Yeah, that's a great point, because it is not always inspiration. It is the sort of thing that, I'd say most of it is not inspiration. You get inspired to write, and you get inspired to maybe tell a particular story, but then it's lower the shoulder and, drive forward. It really is it's work. It is work.
Sit down and crunch out some words today.
Tell me something people would be surprised to know about you.
Oh. Well, I like to sail. That is my relaxation item. I've got a little 16-foot sailboat, and there's a great spot out near Titusville that's a lagoon that is part of the Canaveral National Seashore. and it's in the shadow of the vehicle assembly building over at NASA. And I'd like to go out there and get out there in the morning, sail around. There's dolphins and manatees in this wildlife area, and watch them in the water and just spend the day sailing back and forth and relaxing and getting some sun and listen to the waves.
Sounds nice.
Yeah.
Sounds relaxing. So you're organizing a dinner party. What 3 literary figures or maybe horror characters would you invite, living or dead, literary figures or horror figures would you invite to that dinner?
I think that Mark Twain would be an amazing person to talk to.
Mm-hmm.
I think he would have a natural sense of humor, and there would be just some amazing history that you could, of the time period that he lived through, it would have to be amazing. I would like to talk to Edgar Allan Poe, because to see what he was really like, we in the distant past, anybody who's contemporary to him might not have been paying the kind of attention or have the kind of insight that we have now. But I think he would be a very interesting, although a troubled person.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that would be a very interesting person to talk to.
So you've got Edgar Allan Poe, you got Mark Twain.
And
anybody else come to mind?
I think Charles Dickens would also be interesting, because he was a person who treated it like a job. He got paid by the word, and there's times when you can tell that is exactly how he was getting paid. But I think that his ability to look at it as a business would be interesting, plus his take on the characters, that so many of his characters, how much of that was he taken out of real life? The situations definitely were, the workhouses and some of the places that he mentions. But I think getting stories from him of people who inspired the characters in his book would be hours of entertainment right there.
Right. Well, I would imagine Dickens and Twain doing a lot of talking, and Poe being introverted and probably doing a lot of listening and
drinking. Yeah.
And drinking. There you go. There you go. So I'm curious what you are watching or streaming now on Netflix or Apple TV or Prime Video. What are you streaming these days, or have you recently watched that you can share with us?
From a scary point of view, since we're in that season, just finished watching Behind Her Eyes, which is on Netflix, and it's a 6-episode series that is definitely a psychological thriller, and it builds slow and every episode gets more intense until it gets to the end. It's got an excellent climax, so that was definitely good. And what else did we just finish saying? And from a comedy perspective, I'm way behind the curve, but I'm watching Kim's Convenience, which is a Canadian series that came out a while ago, and that is very clever, very well written, which is nice. You need a counterpoint if you're going to scare yourself on something else. And I've got the new. I was a huge Supernatural fan, and it was very disappointing when they decided to put that series to bed. So the spinoff, The Winchesters, has just come out, and that's DVR'd. I haven't gotten to it yet because I've been up to my neck in pirates, but I got to start diving into that and see how that's coming out.
All right. Well, our guest has been Russell James, horror writer. Appreciate your time.
Hey, thanks, Mike. It was great talking to you. I really had fun.